What's going on, everyone? So I'm here to bring you kind of a initial meta report on some of the very first, if not the very first, as far as I know, cash tournaments out there coming from Take the Initiative, guys. I'll leave a link to this stream down below. It was almost a 9-hour stream. I watched through the whole thing, and of course I took notes. I want to break down the top 8. I want to break down some of the cards that we really got to see and some of the comparisons I have from my time playing online Star Wars Unlimited and seeing where the meta is differing between the two. Overall, it was an amazing stream. Love the tournament. Love just watching Star Wars Unlimited in general from the paper side of things, as you don't always get to see that. The only issue I had with this was some of the cards were hard to find and there was no behind the scenes. So you can see here in like this image, for example, top right, some of the cards were completely like glared out. So I really couldn't find or see some of the cards in some of the games. So I just had to do my best to write notes on what I did find during the tournament to share with you all. So if someone else has found something else out during this time, or maybe someone has behind the scenes information, of course, feel free to message me or leave a comment down below. Before we dive into the top 8, which I've broken down for us, I have a TCG link in the description down below if you want to pick up any of the cards here that I'm going to talk about, or any of the cards in general in set 1 and set 2. Use that link. It helps me out and helps you out. But let's dive into the top 8 and really talk about what happened here. So this was the top 8, and perhaps to no one's surprise, Boba Fett continues to dominate. Now, we have 4 copies or 4 decks running Boba, double yellow Boba, so the cunning kind of streamlined list where you're really leveraging the power of cunning and the additional resources that you're getting from Boba Fett leader. We had 1 original Han, OG Han Green, really awesome list to see. And I think you even saw some cards being played in that list in the previous shot of the video I talked about just a moment ago. We had 1 Sabine Wren Green list. We had a new Han double red list, a list that I've played only a little bit. I've definitely stuck more to the Han Green, the new Han Green, rather than the double red Han. Even though the double red Han is sweet, I think the Han Green list is potentially a little bit more powerful. And one of the most fan favorite lists, which is the Rey red list that a lot of people are talking about, a lot of people are playing, definitely more on the side of discarding and controlling your opponent's hand. Overall, I'm a little bit surprised on kind of the shape up here. Initial thoughts before we dive into each lists and kind of the themes of the decks. I think that this is a symptom of set 2 being extremely early and not necessarily seeing some of the crazy things that can be played in set 2. Some of the lists that I've personally found on my journey through the decks testing and meta is Boba Yellow, still amazing. Han Green, still amazing. Sabine Green, still amazing. These are 3 lists that I explicitly mentioned previously about set 1 and how I thought that their lists were going to still be amazing in set 2. We all know how powerful Poe Dameron and Wrecker are. We know how powerful some of the new tempo tools you get with Boba and just powering up, Boba Yellow, as we saw Forlom Zuckuss, Bazine, all of these types of cards. And then, of course, Han Green just leveraging a lot of the new kind of tempo plays that you could get in Heroism, like Kira, for example. But we didn't really see anything out of the ordinary. Han Green was a deck that was really on my list as something that I could really see. Perhaps just this meta didn't shape up to be, or perhaps we didn't really see anyone register the list. Again, I only got to see the video, the games on camera that was shown to me. I don't have any behind the scenes or anything like that. Besides that, maybe some like offhand comments in the chat or from the caster, etc. So there might have been a ton of Han Green and they just kind of fumbled out, or maybe there was not. I have no idea from that nature of things. On another note, I also expected to see things like Vader Green. The new ramp Vader Green with Crate Dragons is exceptional. Things like we could even see Double Red Kylo, which is a hyper aggressive list. Lots of these lists that I've explicitly stated in my videos that have been really hard to beat in the games that I've played, even running some of the lists you're seeing here, like Han Green, Sabine Green, and Boba Yellow. But those are my initial thoughts on the whole thing. I want to dive into kind of each list explicitly and talk about a few of the cards here. And I'll pull up kind of the the Star Wars Unlimited card database in just a moment to kind of actually show each card. But first, I want to start off with Boba Yellow. Now, mainly, we didn't see any fancy base like Jedha City with this. We saw the 30 HP base, and we were seeing Boba kind of streamline the list. There's a couple of cards that you're used to seeing, which I'll pull up in just a moment. But for the most part, these lists are, well, relatively standard stuff. You're still seeing your favorites, and there isn't really a whole lot of innovation. You just, okay, here's some new cunning villainy cards that we kind of all knew were going to be good, and then they're playing it oftentimes, and you're just really being buffed up by the fact that Boba Fett himself is a 5 to deploy 4/7 leader. If I were to pull up the card database here, just to talk about a few of the cards, the two cards that are obviously the reason this deck was built in the first place, Cunning is the first one up. This is the card we got to see a ton on camera. We got to see various versions of kind of the card itself, and of course I type in Cunning and it's gonna pull up all the different cards that have Cunning in the aspect list. But we got to see the pump effect, we got to see the exhausting, we got to see all the various things with Cunning that make it so excellent. But this card is really absurd. It is a massive tempo play, and there are even in some cases when you can do a double Cunning turn with Boba when he flips over, because he can net you 3 additional resources on that turn, assuming you spent it before, and you can go Cunning into Cunning, which is exceptionally powerful and exceptionally hard to beat, because it also oftentimes just hits for 8, which is really quite absurd. It'll remove your entire board by bouncing everything, by returning it to your hand, or just remove your hand from the game, or just prevent you from even interacting by exhausting a bunch of units. This card is exceptional, and we saw a ton of it. Another card that, of course, the whole deck is kind of built around, or not necessarily built around, but the finisher of the deck, really, Fett's Fire Spray. We knew these two cards were amazing. We saw a ton of them from set 1, and these are still staples. As far as I could understand, I don't have the full deck list, but it looked like everyone was running 3 copies of them because they showed up so frequently on camera, and these cards are kind of the hallmark of the lists. Some of the new cards that we saw, one of the big ones was Bazine. Now, I've talked a lot about this card, and this one is very particular. It can be good in certain areas of the game, but the way people tend to play with this card is not how I view that this card is actually good. It's not really a turn 1 play. It's more of like a turn 4, turn 5 play when your opponent has a key card that they want to get down, and then you play a Bazine to mess up kind of their game plan, rather than trying to take away like a turn 1 or turn 2 play, because that doesn't really do a whole lot. I heard someone on broadcast talk about how this is like Vendilion Clique, which is kind of an interesting comparison for those of you that have played Magic the Gathering before. Vendilion Clique is essentially the same cost in terms of relate, or a little bit more expensive than this, but it has a 3/1 stat line, which is a lot more aggressive, and you're able to play it in response to kind of your opponent drawing some cards on their turn. So it looks at your hand, you get rid of one of those cards, and then they get to draw a card. So very similar. Vendilion Clique was a very powerful card for a while in Magic, but over the course of time it got power crept. I think this card's a lot weaker in comparison to that comparison in Magic because of the weaker body. If this was like a 2/3, I would be much more excited about this card in a lot more scenarios. That doesn't mean it's bad by any means, but it is a card that you want to be particular about in certain areas where, okay, I play it and I mess up my opponent's game plan. Another card that we saw a lot of, Boba Fett's Armor. All right, this card is exceptional in certain areas. Hold on. Actually, I think it's Fett's Armor. No, whoops. It is Boba Fett's Armor. This card's just really exceptional in the right scenario. Realistically, you don't want to put it on anything else but Boba Fett. Otherwise, it's just an academy training. It's just +2/+2. But if you put it on Boba Fett, it makes it really difficult for your opponent to actually deal with it. Why? Because it then becomes a 6/9 because of the absurd stat line that Boba Fett already has. And anything that you hit it with, it reduces that damage by 2. So, well, for one of the other decks that we saw a lot on camera, Han Green, one of their best ways to kind of remove units from the board is playing Han Solo, the unit version. The ambushing 6/6 that deals damage before your opponent's unit deals damage. Well, that actually only does 4 damage to Boba Fett. which is really, really quite weak. And of course, you know, all these other cards that people have, they just deal 2 less, and it really keeps Boba Fett alive. We saw it be decently strong in a lot of scenarios. This is another card where I am super high on, but it's, again, a card that people overvalue in terms of what actual scenarios it's good in. You don't want to hold on to Boba Fett's armor for a ton of time. It's one of those cards where in the right spot, it's going to be game winning. In a lot of other spots, and you try to hold on to it, it could mess up your curve. It could, you know, prevent you from keeping another card in hand. Instead, you try to resource something else to keep this combo in hand. It's not a card that you need to keep onto or keep a hold of in your hand rather than just resourcing it in order to put it just on Boba. Just resource it and then play out your normal kind of Boba Yellow game plan. Do not hold on to it and mess up your potential curve. You know, things like, you know, your 7th Fleet Defenders and, well, Cunnings or whatever you else wanted to play. This is good, but it is another card where it's only good in specific scenarios where Boba Fett really can leverage the fact that, well, he actually can survive through everything that your opponent's doing. And of course, in other scenarios, like when you're fighting Rey Red, for example, they could have things like Rival's Fall, which makes Boba Fett's armor a lot weaker, right? Just remember that. And the last card I kind of want to talk about, or I should say pair of cards, was 4-LOM and Zuckuss. Actually, don't even know how to search it. Maybe that is 4-LOM? Regardless, 4-LOM and Zuckuss, that combination, I saw a couple of kind of ambushing units coming out, and oh man, there we go. There's the pair. This is just a really powerful card. We've seen, you know, ambushers be really good, and we saw Gamorrean guards be played a ton, and people were still playing Gamorrean guards as far as I saw, but 4-LOM to me is a perfect example of what Boba Yellow is trying to do and get a massive advantage from just a card being printed such as 4-LOM. Now, of course, the combination of going 4-LOM into Zuckuss is amazing. Generally speaking, that actually just doesn't happen. 4-LOM is by far, at least in my opinion, and from what we've seen over my experience online and even in some of the paper games, the stronger version. And you don't even need to play Zuckuss for 4-LOM to be amazing. You act as though this is a way to get something off the board from your opponent, keep your unit around. Being a 4/4, that's a lot of damage coming in. And because of Boba Yellow being the tempo-oriented deck that he is, and that Boba Fett comes down the next turn, you could oftentimes keep 4-LOM alive. And that's just removing a unit, potentially trading with 2 units just for 4-LOM. Or you hit a unit, clear the board out, and you're setting up for a massive swing of damage the next turn. It's really powerful. I do like the 4-LOM Zuckuss combination, because if there are scenarios where you do have Zuckuss with 4-LOM, it can literally just win you the entire game very easily. Remember, this guy comes down as a 7/7 ambusher, which basically kills every leader in the game, bar like, you know, Darth Vader and like Emperor Palpatine and stuff like that. But every other, you know, cheaper leader is going to get killed by Zuckuss, and it is really tough to deal with. Those are most often the cards that we were starting to see in Boba Yellow. But that's not all the lists we had. I talked a lot about Boba Yellow because it was half of the top 8. The next one was Han Green. And this was the list that actually ended up in the finals against Boba Yellow, in which Boba Yellow took down the tournament. But Han Green ended up putting up a really nice show. They ended up going all 3 games, or they ended up going to game 3. It was a pretty convincing, you know, power from Han Green. A couple of cards I want to highlight here. Well, the big one for me, and this is the card that I talked about in my previous video, and the card that we saw quite a few times across the matches, and of course a card that I've been super impressed by, Qi'ra. This card just does so much work, especially in the OG Han, because this comes down on turn 2 as a 3/5, which is big enough to where your opponents either have to hit it multiple times and they just trade with it, or it just outclasses some of the units that you play early on, which is really nice. But it also just disrupts your opponent so much. And when you're fighting against things like Boba Yellow or these tempo or aggro decks, in some cases, being able to look at an opponent's hand and just making something cost a little bit more, but not making them, you know, draw an additional card by discarding it, actually just messes them up way more than something like a Bazine might. Because they still have the card in hand. They don't get like another option potentially. It just costs an absurd amount to where it's actually just not really viable. And we saw it many times, target various different things, cards that are just already expensive, think like Fett's Fire Spray, making it cost like 9, so it's just unplayable, or even cheaper cards, on the 3 to 4 5 slot curve, where they made it expensive to the point where, well, it messed up their curve. And well, yeah, later they might have played it for cheaper after killing Kira, but it's done its job, which is kind of get a little bit of tempo advantage going, which is pretty important when it comes to things like Han, where you want to get to that 7 drop turn, right? And when you do get to it, you want to make sure that you can get something to where it's gonna kind of win you the game. Think like, okay, I'm on turn 3, turn 4, whatever it was, and you get Han down, the leader, and then you get a Han unit down, and with a 6/6 ambusher that just kills things without taking any damage, that can absolutely kind of win you the entire game by just controlling the board completely. And things like Kira help you get there. Kira was an absolutely amazing addition. Another thing that we also saw with this Han green deck was the Tech DJ combo. So for those of you that don't know, Tech gives each friendly resource smuggle, and that smuggle cost is that card's cost +2 and its aspect icon. So for example, if let's say Tech was in the resource pile and it didn't already have smuggle, he would be 5 plus heroism to smuggle out from your resource pile. DJ says that when you play it using smuggle, you take control of an enemy resource, and when this unit leaves play, that resource's owner takes control of it. It just says when played using smuggle. Now, he has smuggle on his own card. It's 7 plus double cunning, but he's also 3 and a cunning base cost. So Tech makes him cost 5 and single cunning in the resource pile to smuggle out, which is a significantly more powerful thing to do, especially since with Han's ability, it says to defeat a resource you control. If we pull up Han as a leader, when we use our Han action or we go ahead and attack with the Han leader, you have to defeat a resource that you control at, the start of the next action phase. You can defeat the resource that DJ stole so that it doesn't actually return them even if they get DJ off the battlefield. It's a very potent combo, and it is an interesting one to try to go for. We did see it actually come into play with Tech and DJ. Here's the thing with this. This is definitely a combo that people know about, and you are playing Tech as a 2/5, which is not amazing stat line. But there are other things that you like with Tech, like in the later games, you can also just smuggle out a bunch of things from your resource pile to get some value going. In Han Green, I actually do find Tech plus DJ to be a playable combination, but I don't think it's as strong, and from what we've seen, it's not as strong as you might think. It is a good combo, and it is something that does mess up your opponent and can win you some games, but it's also something that you don't necessarily want to tunnel onto, okay? If you have the correct board state for it, and you have maybe a little bit more control or a sentinel to protect Tech and these types of things, or maybe you just kind of have the right hand for it, then it can mess up your opponent, prevent things like Bobo flips and such things like that. Because remember, you could play Tech on turn 1, and not on turn 2, but on turn 3, you could play DJ if you wanted to. And that's a pretty powerful thing to do because Han guarantees that ramp. No other deck can really do this as efficiently, right? Yes, you could do it with Lando, which is something that I've tried, but that one's pretty weak as well because Lando puts you down a resource, whereas Han's putting you down cards in hand. Because you're smuggling things out, it actually negates that downside. Overall, we saw DJ mess up things and provide very big tempo swings. Going up a resource and your opponent going down a resource is absolutely massive. It's just a matter of, can it be set up correctly? And if it can, it does some major work. This was a pretty powerful combo that we did see a couple of times on broadcast, which was really cool to see. And it is a combo that you have to be aware of. If you're not aware of it and you're fighting things like Han Green or double yellow Han or like Lando or any card that's like heroism plus cunning, then it could really catch you off guard and completely mess up your game plan. It's when you know about it that it becomes a lot weaker. So if you're getting surprised by this, make sure you incorporate it into your strategy going forward because it can absolutely swing the game. Those were kind of the two most important things I saw from Han to kind of see some really powerful set 2 things going on. We saw, of course, the classics, things like Bright Hope, things like Han Solo unit, and all the classics that Han Green typically plays. But overall, those were kind of the two most potent set 2 things that I was seeing with Han Green, and it was awesome to see it all the way in the finals. Next one we got to talk about is the Sabine Green. Now, this is a list that I'm actually building in paper, but it's far different from the list that at least what I saw on camera. Now, the Sabine Green list that I play is a much more set 2 base list with a heavy Mandalorian synergy and a focus on benefiting from Darksaber and acting as if Darksaber is almost like a for a cause in your deck that allows you to just get in for massive chunks of damage because it pumps up Sabine, allows you to attack, and then pumps up your other units. So a couple of cards that I want to highlight here in Sabine Green that we saw, which are of course just awesome. One card that is really awesome is Sundari Peacekeeper. We also saw this in Han Green, so this is just a nice call out. This is a card that really just helps you do so much, allowing you to either race your opponents or just get in for a lot of damage while making sure that it basically doesn't die because of that 5 toughness. In Han Green, this also did a lot of work, and this is one of the most powerful green heroism cards to come out from set 2. Now, in this Sabine Green list, we actually saw a little bit more of a rebel theme that we're used to seeing. Things like fleet lieutenants, things like, wing leaders, and the classics that you're seeing in Sabine, right? Battlefield Marines, all that type of stuff. Which I think, at least from my experience in playing both of them, is a little bit more consistent because you're playing all the rebels and you're able to benefit from all that, kind of rebel synergy that you're used to seeing, but far less powerful in terms of being able to kind of close out the game. The Darksaber, not necessarily full Mandalorian, but slight Mandalorian theme, especially using things like Ketsu Onyo on turn 1, and things like Sabine Wren that you're used to on turn 1 can be absolutely massive. Even with the cards that we saw in the tournament, Ketsu Onyo can really do a lot of work. Removing Rey experience, removing things like Boba Fett's armor and such, random upgrades that just get absolutely murdered, and we didn't really see Ketsu Onyo really pop off in this tournament. I couldn't remember if I even saw a copy of this in the Sabine Green players list. But overall, Sabine Green did do some massive work. This is a list that there's only one of in the top 8. So unlike Boba Yellow, where we talked about it a lot more, it didn't perform as well as Boba Yellow. Normally we're used to seeing 2 to 3 copies of Sabine in top 8. So honestly, of the list that we're seeing here, Sabine underperformed from what we're used to. And that might just be because we haven't found the right combination of Sabine. But of course, some of the cards that really do help her out, and if you see a lot of them and you draw them a lot, Poe Dameron and Wrecker are the kind of key cards that you're really looking for, especially with ECL and time interventions, things like that. It can really take over the game. Poe is obviously amazing, but actually Poe I oftentimes just play out. There are some situations where I will want to ECL this out, but Wrecker is the type of card that really just hits in for a ton because of that overwhelm and the ability to stack the 5 damage before you actually overwhelm and ambush your opponent. This acts as if, well, you get a massive body, you remove some of your opponent's board state, and you get in for oftentimes 4 to 6 damage, which is really crazy. So these 2 cards have helped out Sabine a ton and are the reason why I think we're going to see more of Sabine as soon as we figure out the correct combination. Han Solo Double Red. This was a cool list. I didn't get to see too much of it. We didn't get to see too much Double Red Han. Of course, the list that we often saw on camera were the Double Yellow Boba and Han Green because they ended up in the finals. And there's just 4 top 8 Boba Yellows. But Han Red, 2 cards that I really want to call out in this list, and one that was really surprising for me was Wild Rancor. Now, in Han Red, this is a 5 resource 6/6 overwhelm that deals 2 damage to each other ground unit. This actually does some really nice work. The tricky part about this one is that it also deals damage to your own units. And if you're playing Han, you're already dealing a good amount of damage to your units as you go up the curve. And so this could actually kill off your own units, but it also just does a massive amount of work against your opponent's units. Dealing that 2 damage to each other ground unit allows you to actually hit those ground units and hit their base for a lot more damage while controlling the board, which is really, really cool. He also comes down the same turn that Han Leader comes down, which means that you can really just remove basically everything on the battlefield while also leaving behind a 6/6 body, which is really quite powerful, especially for 5 resources. Now, you also could play things like Poe and things like, Wrecker. Poe comes down as a 4 resource 6/4, which is crazy, plus the amazing ability that he has. You can play Wrecker, which comes down again same time as Wild Rancor and can kill things and such. The big thing with double red Han that you don't get is that ECL, and is the fact that you can't play some of the awesome turn one plays like Sundari Peacekeeper, and you don't get things like timely intervention. So the ambushing potential and some of the other options that you have go away. Of course, things like Bo-Katan are amazing. This is kind of like the new Battlefield Marine, but it's a 1 resource 3/1 in Han if you want it to be, and it can end up drawing you cards a little bit later on. We got to see like aggression, and of course all the classic double red cards that you're used to seeing. Of course, I type in Bo and it's gonna come up with a million different things because BO is like in every single card. Maybe I type in Bo-Katan and that will change it. Oh, never mind, she's right here. Anyways, I really was impressed with Han double red. I didn't expect to see that version of Han coming into the top 8. Again, I would have loved to see a complete breakdown of every single list that we saw in the tournament or even outside of what we saw on broadcast, and whether or not the other Han lists were there in droves, or maybe there was just a couple of them, or maybe it wasn't, a lot, etc. But overall, Bo-Katan, Wild Rancor are the 2 cards that really saw some really nice work being done in Han Red. Lastly, we saw Rey Red. Now, this is a fan favorite list. A couple of cards to mention from set 2. In general, with these set 2 decks, like with Han as the leader and Rey as the leader, of course, we have to mention the leader themselves. And in Han's case, he just ramps you, dealing 2 damage less. I talked about with Wild Rancor. In Rey's case, I want to explicitly talk about her before we dive into some of the cards, because she enables so many of your random cards that you would have enjoyed playing on set 1, but also the fact that they are being played in set 2 with the additional power increase. Things like, Yoda. They're not a 2/4 anymore, it's a 3/5, which could be a lot more powerful. Things like R2 is now a 2/5. Things like, heck, even one of the new cards, Moisture Farmer. So that's 0/4 for 1. It's a 1/5 for 2. And then it becomes potentially a 3/7 if you invest more experience to them. It's really powerful as a frontside action. Anytime we see these like 1-costed actions, it ends up making your hand a lot better. Think like Darth Vader, for example. You just play something, you get some extra value out of it. And in Rey's case, her extra value is extremely impactful. And then she deploys for 6 as a 2/6. And this is a leader that initially I was like, dang, this seems really mediocre. But what really changes her to be something that's really threatening is the Restore 3 on the flip side, and her becoming a 3/7 on attacks. She just gives you so much value and allows you to actually get that value within your deck because of the Restore 3. If her and her deck didn't have as many restoring options, it would be a lot easier to deal with. A couple of cards I want to call out here. Arguably the kind of card that you think about the most when you're thinking about Rey Red, Pillage. Choose a player, discarding 2 cards from their hand. This is really strong against a lot of different types of decks. For example, Han Green. This wrecks Han Green. This is a really amazing card against Han Green. Now, of course, you're going to have to play at the right spot, and you're going to have to make sure that when you draw, it's not dead. Of course, you could always resource it. But think about what Han's trying to do. It's trying to trade cards in hand for resources temporarily to play even more expensive cards that they have in hand way ahead of curve. Pillage prevents that. Discarding 2 cards from an opponent's hand makes it so that Han Green, the original Han, can't really afford to use their action more than a couple times in a single game. Whereas in often other games, you can play maybe 2, 3, 4 times with Han action. Well, this, maybe you can't even use Han action at all because you just don't have the quantity of cards in hand needed to do so. And in some cases, if you are trying to set up like a Han Solo 7 turn where, it's turn 4, you have 5 resources, you action, put a card into play as a resource, you flip Han, you try to attack, you get your 7 resources, you play U-Wing reinforcements, a Han Solo, that type of stuff. Pillage negates that by potentially removing all options you have from your hand. It really messes up some decks, and Han Green is a perfect example of this, and it's just really powerful in there. Of course, we have other discard cards like Force Throw, which works well with Yodas, Kanans, Reys themselves. We have things like Disabling Fang Fighter, which are all kind of classic set 1 cards. Oh my gosh, I can't type. But these cards are just really strong in general, just getting rid of random upgrades that we saw across the field. But of course, you're also able to just play high value plays across the curve. One of the biggest cards in kind of blue heroism that I've paid attention to is Queel. The ability to, get that restore 1 and in range, Queel can become a 3/4, which is really powerful. But also be able to draw additional cards really gives you so many additional options and negates a lot of the downside with Rey Red, which is one of the big things with hand manipulation and hand disruption in TCG games is, or I should say TC games, trading card games. Oftentimes they're dead draws when you draw them into the middle towards late game part. But with Queel, you could just resource them, and because you're drawing additional cards, you have more options. And the last set 2 card I want to call out here with Rey Red, and this is an important one to kind of prevent your opponent from just getting out of control. This is Rival's Fall. One of the big things with set 2 is there are a lot of upgrades running around, and there are a lot of ways to make your leader really hard to deal with. And before, there was really not many ways to deal with a leader. Rival's Fall does it very cleanly. And with Rey Red, the idea behind Rey Red is that you're trying to use these hand disruption cards. You're trying to use, things like Pillage, things like Force Throw, get a little value and outgrind your opponent using your Restore. And sometimes you just need a catch-all, and Rival's Fall is exactly that. This is a very, very important card in the Rey Red list, and we did see it come into play. One thing to note here that I just want to call out, I don't remember seeing it, but you could also in Rey Red play Kylo Ren, which I think is worthwhile. It is a very powerful 6 resource play. And remember, as long as you have the Rey leader, you're able to just play Kylo Ren for 6 resources, which is nice. And you're always going to get that experience token on attack with Kylo in that deck because there's no other villainy cards that you're playing. So that can be pretty powerful. Just a little bit of a call out here. But that was all the top 8 lists that we got to see. Some of the cards, some of the key cards in them. Overall, my final thoughts on kind of top 8 here in the tournament. We didn't see that much innovation or that much difference in terms of what I thought I would see in terms of top 8ing. That might just be because Boba Yellow is that powerful, and this is what people think is the absolute meta. But again, without the complete details of what's going on behind the scenes and whether or not people registered or what the meta of potentially this particular event was, it's hard to say whether or not this is going to shape up to be another Boba dominated set. But there are a lot of games that I have played against Boba Yellow because I myself think Boba Yellow is quite strong. So I've played Boba Yellow, and I've also played against a bunch of Boba Yellow. And I don't think, as far as my experience has been, this should be representative of set 2 meta going forward, in that I don't think Boba Yellow is by far the most dominant deck, as this is showing here in the top 8. I could be wrong, but there is also the consideration that perhaps the new set 2 decks, like with Han and Rey, it was a little bit more unfamiliar, whereas people are extremely familiar with the Boba Yellow, and so it was much easier to kind of play with those decks. There could be that consideration. Not saying that was the case. I couldn't really tell, a lot of some plays on camera, as I said. But there's also the consideration that maybe people just weren't ready for Boba Yellow, and the sideboards weren't, properly constructed for the matchup against Boba Yellow, or perhaps the main decks weren't really considering a very high value tempo list just coming in and kind of beating down. And of course, that is what Boba Yellow is. It just does so much work. And of course, Cunning will always be, at least for now, I should say always be, but at least for the first couple of sets here, one of the most powerful cards to build around, and we still see that here. The decks that I have on my watch list going forward, various variations of Sabine Green. I do think that it is a very powerful list, and I think that it is able to compete with things like Boba Yellow still. Even though in last set it was a lot weaker to things like Boba, I think that it got a lot stronger with Poe Dameron and Wrecker and like Darksaber, things like that. Second thing is Han, various variations of Han Green, the aggro and the more ramp version. That could be really powerful. We didn't really see Crate Dragon really come into play in this tournament, but it really is a powerful card and can definitely take over games, especially in like the Ray Red matchup or the Han Green matchup. That's where it really comes in. Against Boba Yellow and Sabine Green's a little bit slow. Vader Green, the ramp Vader Green, very, very powerful. It might be a little bit slow against things like Sabine Wren and Boba, but overall that could be a very powerful list. And we can even see if Boba Yellow is the list to beat, this tempo-oriented list, perhaps something that either could go even faster, like Sabine Green lists that are built to defeat Boba, like explicitly building for that purpose, or we could see something a little bit different, which is a little bit more controlling mid-range lists in order for you to kind of counteract their early advantage with all those resources, just trying to control the board and get to that little later part of the game, which is kind of what Han Green was trying to do, although that's a little bit more tempo oriented because of course of that temporary resource. Regardless, guys, this was a fun tournament to watch. I'm sorry I could give you the exact numbers on all the lists being played and everything like that. I will say at the end here, some of the early matches, we did see some crazy lists like Kira, Cad Bane, that type of stuff. But it seems like those lists didn't compete against those other lists that we saw on camera. And, well, of course, the top 8 here. Or maybe that was just not necessarily a completely tuned list, whereas these have been kind of hammered out, at least the ones on the left. I'm not sure. Again, I don't have the complete list breakdowns, and I don't know what the lists were even consisting of. I don't know, what went wrong in those games or whatever. I just saw a couple games early on in the broadcast. Overall, this is kind of an initial meta report. I plan on doing a kind of meta tier list, going through each and every deck that is kind of showing up in the meta and where they situate themselves, at least based on my experience in the online meta. Regardless, all of these lists are definitely all these decks I would definitely put in like the A to S tier, except for maybe Han Red. I would not have put necessarily Han Red in the A to S tier because I think Han Green has shown itself to be a little bit more powerful, at least in the matches that I've played. Regardless, I could be wrong, and we'll see going forward. Thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below, and I'll see you all for the next one.